Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Chapter 10. And in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about some economic events of the early 19th century. We're going to start with the American system, which is some plans for economic growth and an economic future of the nation. And we're going to wrap up with an economic crisis that takes place in 1819. Call this section, and it's titled the same in your book, Nationalism and its Discontents, because we're talking about how are we actually going to build a nation out of these sometimes disparate states. Okay, so let's start with this idea of an American system. Right, the American system is proposed by James Madison in a State of the Union address. This is the annual address required by the Constitution where the president appears before both houses of Congress. It was often delivered as a letter and sometimes as a speech. Today, it's always a speech. So in this address, James Madison proposes some efforts to bind and unify the nation. This is in the years following the War of 1812, right? What sometimes is called the Second War for American Independence. Well, this is going to get picked up by some famous senators, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They're here in the bottom of our screen. They are, this is them older. We didn't have photographs or daguerreotypes of them when they were younger. This is James Madison, who was older at the time. And so we have a painting of him. But here we have James Madison, who was president, and then a couple of senators who are proposing what would become known as, and Henry Clay coins this term, the American system. And he's going to argue that the new legislation ought to contain three parts. One, they ought to renew the charter of a national bank. It had expired in 1811, so we did not have a national bank. He says we need to renew that charter. Think back to Alexander Hamilton and his ideas for a new bank. We'll get into that controversy in a second, and Mr. McCarty will dig in a little bit deeper later. Two, a protective tariff, taxes on imports, but not just to raise money. We're now talking about taxes to protect industries. And three, internal improvements. This is a national network of roads and canals, no longer leaving it up to the states to build these transportation networks, but let's have a unified national network for transportation. All right, each one of these is going to be controversial for its own reasons. So let's start with the new national bank. Why do we need a bank? Well, the argument that Alexander Hamilton had made way back in the 1790s was that we needed a national bank in order to get the country's finances in order, to provide loans, to have a balanced and consistent financial fiscal policy as a nation. We ought to have monetary policy that makes sense, right? That can provide some stability to lending. And so a national bank, Madison and Clay and Calhoun, eventually, as they're proposing this, would argue was necessary to moving the country forward economically. Okay, there's going to be a lot of controversy about this. There's going to be a lot of people who hate the bank, just like Thomas Jefferson did, for a variety of reasons. Mr. McCarty is going to get into that in more detail. But just as a sneak preview, some people are going to hate it because they think it benefits only one region of the country, and other people are going to hate it because they think it's corrupt. And the people who run the bank are using it for their own purposes. And then we have yet a third group of people that are really going to hate the bank because they believe it's unconstitutional. And they're going to continue to stick with this argument that the Constitution doesn't allow a bank to be created. That question will be answered in 1819 with the Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland that will ultimately affirm the constitutionality of a national bank. But we'll get there later. Okay, so a new national bank is pillar number one of the American system. Pillar number two is a protective tariff. So let's define that term first. So a tariff is a tax or a duty that is to be paid on a particular type of product, right? Usually imports or exports. And in this case, and throughout American history, we're primarily talking about taxing imports. All right. Now, you might think that this tax would be to raise revenues, but actually it was conceived of as a protective tariff, which begs the question, what is it protecting? What makes a tariff protective? Well, the United States in the early 1800s is experiencing rapid economic growth, but remember we are brand new to the to the industrial model, right? And so we're just kind of beginnings to get under our feet underneath ourselves as a country that's going to produce manufactured goods. We're competing with places like Britain, and we're not as strong as they are. We have an infant industry. We're kind of babies at this. And so the proposal is that we need to create a tax on imported goods that we are also producing here in our nation so that the price will be roughly equivalent. Right? Britain is more efficient and effective in making higher quality, lower priced manufactured goods. And so our factories are having a hard time competing. So this tariff, this tax on British goods that are being imported into the United States will level the playing field and protect American industries. If the tariff is high enough, it might make, because that cost will be passed along to the consumer, it might make the British goods actually more expensive than the goods that are being produced here in the United States, which would be a boon to American industry. So the goal of the protective tariff is to protect American industry so that people will buy American goods and help the American economy and American industry grow. Now, my last question would be, who's going to support this? You can imagine that there would be some folks who would be more supportive of this than others, and it's really going to break down by region. The regions that have the manufacturing, think of Massachusetts with the Lowell mills, Samuel Slater's mill in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the New England area. Those areas are the areas that are kind of home to this new industry. They are going to see the most direct benefit, right? It is their industry that is being protected. The southern and western regions aren't going to receive as much protection because they're not involved in manufacturing. They're not involved in industry. They're producing raw materials. So for them, all this means is that the price of the manufactured goods that they are used to purchasing, mostly from Great Britain, is going to go up. And they're not going to be happy about that. So that's going to be a controversy that will continue throughout this market revolution time period, where you will see there's going to be some divisions along regional lines in support and opposition to a protective tariff. Okay, lastly, internal improvements. And this, a lot of folks thought, would address concerns that the country was getting too big and too spread out, and it was going to be fractured as a result of that. If we could create good national networks of transportation, the idea was we would be bound together as a nation. This, again, is maybe going to break along regional lines. There are some regions, it's argued, that are going to benefit most from these transportation networks, namely those that are sending out and now able to sell their manufactured goods to the other regions, particularly the Northeast selling to the West. The southern states in particular are concerned that most of these roads look like they're ending up in the northern and western regions, and they don't feel it's fair that they would be paying in taxes for national improvements, a national transportation network that was kind of leaving them out. So there's going to be a lot of regional controversy over internal improvements. It's also, again, controversial because there's a question of whether or not this is something that the national government should be doing. Is this within their power? Is this within their authority to build roads, to pay for canals? Is that something that the Constitution granted Congress the power to do? Okay. All right. So this is the American system. Next, we're going to get into an economic crisis that happens at the time. But right now, we're laying the foundations for a strong, solid, unified economy in the United States. But I just want you to know it's controversial. There's going to be people who approve of this and people who oppose this. And I want you to kind of see this as the next step in that debate between Hamilton and Jefferson. All right. Let's finish by turning our attention to an economic crisis of this time period, the Panic of 1819. With the end of the War of 1812, America was feeling a new spirit of pride and independence. At the same time, they were experiencing an economic boom of sorts. During the war, trade with Europe had been cut off. And now that the war was over, the U.S. was working overtime to meet European demand for American materials. This, coupled with westward expansion, led to an increase in land speculation, which fueled land purchases and massive amounts of loans. Let's slow down for a second and define some of these terms. Speculation. In economics, what we mean by speculation is a belief that something is going to increase or decrease in value. In this case, it was land. And the thought was that Western lands were going to be increasing in value as settlement and cotton production expanded. So people began to buy that Western land up. But in order to buy the land, most people needed loans. Loans that banks were happy to give. That is how banks make their money. They loan out money at interest. The debtor, the person who takes the loan or borrows the money from the bank, will pay the bank back more than they originally borrowed as the price of borrowing the money. This works really great for both groups, especially when the product that you're purchasing, in this case, Western land, increases in value, or if it generates you income that is greater than the money you owe the bank. This is exactly what those Western speculators were anticipating, that the land that they purchased would increase in value, thus increasing their wealth and allowing them to pay back the bank, or they were going to continue to expand their cotton production, which would increase their income. It doesn't work so well if the value of the land decreases or if it costs you income. All went well for about 6 years, and then we ran into a problem. European demand for American resources began to return to those pre-War of 1812 levels. The spike in demand was a result of American surpluses and 2 years of limited international trade. It wasn't going to last. With the decrease of European demand, we saw a drop in the prices of cotton, which is going to affect land prices. In 1819, the speculative bubble burst. Demand waned, and as a result, Western lands rapidly decreased in value. Incomes went down, and borrowers were unable to make their loan payments. This is known as the Panic of 1819. This was a common economic trend in American history. Speculation is going to lead to rapid economic growth, but when the growth can't be sustained, a panic or depression results. So we're going to stop here for now. We will move into the Missouri Compromise, and you'll hear the rest of the topics of Chapter 10 from Mr. McClarty.